The judge looked down at the young woman sitting alone at the defendant's table and said, in a voice that carried just enough pity to be insulting, "Monsieur Zosi Bonsu, I see you've chosen to represent yourself today." The courtroom rippled with quiet laughter. Her ex-husband Garrett? No, that name was taken. Her ex-husband Rowan? No, let me start again properly. The judge looked down at the woman at the left table and said, "Ms. Nakamura. I need to check names first before writing the full story to ensure compliance. Let me read the used names list carefully and then write without interruption." The judge looked down at the woman sitting alone at the left table and said, with the kind of pity that manages to feel worse than contempt, "Messieurs Okafor, I see you've chosen to represent yourself today." The courtroom didn't laugh out loud. It was too polished for that. But the sound that moved through the room, a soft, collective exhale of amusement, was somehow more degrading than laughter would have been. Her ex-husband, Bryce, was seated at the right table with his legal team fanned out around him like a hand of expensive cards. Bryce Alderton. The man who had called her his greatest adventure the night he proposed. He was leaning sideways now, whispering something to the woman beside him. Tara, 26 years old, an influencer with a skincare line and a remarkable talent for being present wherever Bryce needed an audience. Tara touched his arm and smiled a smile that didn't know what it was celebrating yet. It would, soon enough. "Miss Okafor?" the judge repeated. "Yes, Your Honor." "Nadia?" The woman stood. Her name was Cecile Okafor Mensah. She was 31 years old, and she was wearing a blazer she had bought at Value Village on Elgin Street for $14. It fit perfectly. She had altered it herself on a borrowed sewing machine at 2 in the morning, which was in many ways a precise summary of her last 3 years. "The court notes," said Bryce's lawyer, a man named Harold Finch who billed at $750 an hour, and had the air of someone who had never once waited for a bus, "that Mrs. Alderton has filed a financial disclosure that frankly borders on fiction." He paused. He was good at pauses, he let them do work. "She has declared total assets of approximately $4,000, a used vehicle, and what she describes as freelance consulting income. No firm, no corporate registration, no tax filings consistent with any meaningful professional activity." Bryce shook his head slowly, as though this grieved him. "The court should understand," Finch continued, placing his hands flat on the table, "that my client has been more than generous. The offer on the table, a on-time payment of $15,000 in 30 days to vacate the matrimonial home in Westboro, is a settlement that any reasonable person would accept. Mrs. Alderton has refused. She has chosen instead to bring this court her handwritten notes and her homemade blazer, and to request spousal support on the grounds of a contribution that she has provided zero documentation to substantiate." Someone in the gallery coughed. Tara picked a piece of lint from Bryce's shoulder and he let her. Cecile looked at the clock on the wall above the judge's head. 9:47 a.m. She needed 8 more minutes. "Okafor Mensah," the judge said with the particular patience reserved for people he expected to lose. "Do you have a response?" "I do, Your Honor," she said. "But I'd like to request a brief indulgence. I'm expecting a document to be delivered to the court by 10 o'clock. Finch was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is a delay tactic. We've been waiting 3 months for Mrs. Alderton to comply with the financial disclosure requirements, and now she's asking us to pause proceedings for a document." "What document?" "A shareholder agreement," Cecile said calmly, "and an audit." The word landed differently than she expected. She had expected more laughter maybe. Instead, there was a quality of stillness that felt new. Bryce's smile stayed on his face, but something behind it shifted. She had seen that look before. The night she told him she was thinking of filing her own company registration, he had made the same face. A smile with a crack in it that he didn't know she could see. Judge Miriam Osei Asante, one of the most respected family law judges in Ontario, a woman who had presided over 30 years of precisely this kind of theater, set down her pen. "Mr. Finch, I'll allow a 10-minute recess. If the document Okafor Mensah is referring to does not materialize by 10:15, we proceed without it." "Understood?" "Understood, Your Honor," Cecile said. In the hallway outside Courtroom 7 of the Ottawa Courthouse on Elgin Street, the air smelled of old carpet and fluorescent lighting and the ghosts of 1,000 bad days. Cecile sat on a wooden bench and pressed her palm flat against the cold wall behind her. She had not slept well. That was fine. She hadn't slept well in 4 years. You learn to operate on different fuel. Bryce and Finch were at the far end of the hall, conferring in low voices. Tara had stayed in the gallery with her phone out, probably live posting. That was all right too. Cecile reached into her bag. Not the Value Village blazer bag. The other one, the plain gray tote she carried everywhere. The one that Bryce used to make fun of because it wasn't branded. She pulled out a phone and checked the screen. One message, in the elevator, 2 minutes. She closed her eyes. She thought about Ottawa in February, the way the cold came up off the Rideau River and got into your bones no matter how well you dressed. She thought about the apartment she had lived in after Bryce moved out. Before he decided, actually, that he was the one who had been wronged, and therefore he was the one who should keep the house. The apartment on Gladstone with the broken radiator and the neighbor who played guitar at 11 p.m. She had worked in that apartment. She had worked every day in that apartment, often until 3 or 4 in the morning, in a sleeping bag, because she couldn't afford to run the heat and the laptop at the same time. She thought about the moment she had decided not to tell Bryce the truth. It hadn't been a dramatic decision. It was quiet. It happened on a Sunday afternoon about 8 months ago, when Bryce had handed her a legal document across the kitchen table. The kitchen table she had refinished herself from a piece she found on Facebook Marketplace, and said, "I had Harold draw this up. I think it's fair." He had said it the way you say something, when you know it isn't fair at all, but you're betting the other person is too tired or too broken to push back. She hadn't told him then that she had been up until 4 that morning, finishing the licensing agreement that would give Meridian Health Solutions exclusive rights to the diagnostic triage software she had spent 2 years building in that cold apartment. She hadn't told him the licensing fee was $4.2 million, paid out over 18 months, with a royalty structure that would continue for the life of the patent. She had looked at his handsome, confident face across the refinished table, and she had thought, not yet. The doors to the courthouse opened. 3 people walked in. The one in the lead was a woman named Dorothea Ainsworth, 62 years old, silver-haired, with a posture that suggested she had spent her career in rooms full of people who underestimated her, which she had. She was a senior partner at Ainsworth Doobie LLP, one of the most respected IP and commercial law firms in the country. Behind her came 2 associates, each carrying matching black briefcases with the firm's name embossed in discreet gold lettering. Dorothea didn't look around the hallway. She walked directly to Cecile, extended a hand and said, "The documents are authenticated and the wire confirmation came through at 9:52. We're ready." Cecile shook her hand. "Thank you, Dorothea." At the far end of the hall, Bryce Alderton watched this exchange with the particular expression of a man who has just realized, for the first time, that he may have made an error in calculation. He said something to Finch. Finch adjusted his glasses and said something back. Neither of them looked reassured. Cecile stood up, smoothed the $14 blazer, and walked back into the courtroom. Courtroom 7 had been refilling as the recess ended, and the energy in the room was different now. Word travels fast in courthouse hallways. Cecile noticed a court reporter sitting up straighter. She noticed a junior associate on Finch's team leaning over to whisper to a colleague. She noticed Judge Osei Asante watching Dorothea Ainsworth's entrance with an expression that was carefully neutral but noticeably alert. Dorothea set her briefcase on Cecile's table and opened it without ceremony. She placed a bound document in front of the judge's clerk and a copy on Cecile's table. She did not look at Harold Finch. She did not need to. "Your Honor," Finch said, his voice carrying a new, careful quality. "I'm not sure what's happening here, but I'd like to know who these individuals are and what standing they have in these proceedings." "I'm happy to clarify," Dorothea said. Her voice was the kind of voice that had never once been described as shrill. It was a voice that had delivered terrible news to boardrooms and walked away still standing. "I am Dorothea Ainsworth, senior partner at Ainsworth Dube. I'm not appearing as counsel for Ms. Okafor-Mensah in the divorce proceedings. I'm appearing as legal representative for Birchline Solutions Inc., which has material documentation relevant to the court's assessment of this case." "Birchline Solutions," the judge said. "I'm not familiar." "You will be," Dorothea said simply. She nodded to Cecile. Cecile stood up. She had practiced this moment in the bathroom mirror of the Gladstone apartment, and she had practiced it in her head on the drive here, this morning, and she was practicing it right now, in real time, because she understood that what she said in the next 4 minutes determined the shape of the next 4 decades. "Your Honor," she said, "Birchline Solutions is the parent company of a medical software product called ClearPath, which is a diagnostic triage platform currently in use at 14 hospitals across Ontario, British Columbia, and Alberta, with licensing negotiations underway with the provincial health ministries of Quebec and Nova Scotia. The initial licensing agreement was signed 14 weeks ago for $4.2 million. The company is wholly owned by the person that Mr. Finch has described as having total assets of $4,000. The room was very quiet. Bryce turned to look at her. It was the first time he had looked at her, really looked at her, in the courtroom. She held his gaze. She did not smile. "That person," she continued, "is me." Finch was already standing. "Your Honor, this is clearly fabricated." This woman has not filed any corporate documentation. She has no. Mr. Finch, the judge's voice was quiet, but it stopped him cold. She was reading the document Dorothea had placed before her. She turned a page. She turned another. Please sit down. He sat. The judge read for 2 full minutes. Nobody in the courtroom spoke. Tara had lowered her phone. Bryce's jaw was doing something complicated. Miss Okafor Mensah, the judge said at last, setting the document down. Am I reading correctly that Birchline Solutions was incorporated 31 months ago? Yes, Your Honor. And that you are the sole founder, sole director and controlling shareholder? Yes, Your Honor. During a period of time that overlapped with your marriage to Mr. Alderton? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Osi Asante turned to Harold Finch with an expression that Cecile had not seen on a judge's face before, but which she suspected Finch had seen several times in his career, because the blood under his skin shifted noticeably when he saw it. Mr. Finch, the judge said, it appears your client's financial disclosure was, to use your word, the one that borders on fiction. Bryce's hand came flat down on the table. She never told me about any of this. She hid this from me. She deliberately. Mr. Alderton, the judge did not raise her voice. You will have the opportunity to speak when it is your turn to speak. Finch leaned over and put a hand on Bryce's arm. Bryce shrugged it off. Cecile remained standing. There was a particular feeling she had not expected, which was that the moment of victory felt less like fireworks and more like a window opening in a room that has been closed a very long time. The air that came in was cold and clean and entirely her own. Your Honor, Dorothea said, we've also filed under separate tab a forensic accounting report detailing the contributions Miss Okafor Mensah made to the matrimonial household during the marriage, including the period in which she was building Birchline. We can demonstrate that she continued to fund shared household expenses from her personal account at a level consistent with her stated freelance income, while the development and financing of Birchline was conducted entirely from a separate corporate account she opened and maintained independently. She was hiding money, Bryce said loudly. She was hiding assets. That's fraud, Bryce. Cecile turned to look at him. She used his name the way you'd use a tool, not with cruelty, just with precision. I didn't hide anything from you. You never asked. The courtroom was silent. You never asked, she said again. Not once in 6 years did you ask what I was working on when you went to sleep. You assumed. You assumed it was nothing, because you had decided, somewhere along the way, that I was the kind of person who did nothing worth noticing. She stopped. That was enough. She wasn't here to perform. She had said what was true. I'd like to request an adjournment, Finch said. His voice had lost something. The instrument was still there, but the confidence behind it was different now. Uncertain, searching for the ground it had been standing on. My client needs time to review these materials. Your client, the judge said, had 3 months of disclosure deadlines and chose not to use them to investigate the financial circumstances of his spouse. She paused. That said, I am going to grant a 30-day adjournment. During that time, I am ordering a full financial disclosure from both parties, to be filed with this court and reviewed by an independent forensic accountant. She looked at Bryce directly. Mr. Alderton, I would also strongly suggest that you have a conversation with Mr. Finch about the implications of proceeding with a spousal support claim of $15,000 when the court is now in possession of evidence suggesting your former spouse's annual earnings may be significantly greater than you disclosed in your filing. Bryce's face was a landscape from which everything recognizable had been removed. Finch said something to him in a low voice. Bryce did not respond. Court is adjourned, the judge said and brought down the gavel. The sound, in that room, in that particular moment, was like a door closing on an era. The drive back to Westboro took 20 minutes in light traffic. Cecile sat in the passenger seat of Dorothea's firm car, a sensible Volvo because Dorothea was a person who made sensible choices consistently, and watched the Ottawa River through the window. The ice was breaking up in patches. February was ending. You did well in there, Dorothea said. I was terrified, Cecile said. You were, Dorothea agreed. You hid it effectively. They drove in silence for a moment. The radio was off. The city moved past them at a reasonable pace. He's going to fight it, Cecile said. He will, Dorothea agreed. Men like Bryce Alderton don't stop when they're wrong. They stop when continuing becomes more expensive than walking away. We're going to make sure continuing becomes very expensive. Cecile looked at her hands in her lap. They were still. She was surprised by that. For the last 2 years, her hands had always been moving, typing, sketching interface diagrams on napkins, writing on whiteboards at 2 a.m. Even when she wasn't working, they fidgeted. Now they were folded quietly in her lap, and she thought that was probably meaningful in some way she'd understand later. The press will find out, Dorothea said, about Clearpath, about Birchline. A medical software company with a $4 million licensing deal, founded by a woman representing herself in divorce court. That's a story. Are you ready for that? Not particularly, Cecile said. But I didn't build it to hide it forever. She had built it, she could say now that she was past the worst of it, because she had needed something to do with the specific kind of pain that doesn't go anywhere. When Bryce had started pulling away, not dramatically, not in one moment she could point to, but gradually, the way water finds cracks in concrete, she had gone quiet, and in the quiet, she had worked. She had taken the skills she'd developed over 8 years as a healthcare systems analyst. Skills she'd mentioned at dinner parties and been met with polite nodding, because healthcare analytics was not the kind of thing that made people lean forward at dinner parties. And she had done something with them. She had seen, in her years of contract work with regional health authorities, how much time was wasted in emergency departments because of triage bottlenecks. How patients waited 6 hours for an assessment that could have been completed in 40 minutes with better intake logic. She had built, very quietly, in a cold apartment on Gladstone Avenue, a software system that could process patient intake data in real time and route cases with a precision that the existing manual systems couldn't come close to matching. She had tested it against historical data from 3 hospitals. She had refined it for 18 months. She had filed for a patent in her own name, quietly, through a lawyer Bryce had never met. And then she had licensed it. The money had not been the point. The money was, at this stage, almost beside the point. The point was that she had made something real, something that was being used in actual emergency rooms by actual nurses at 3 in the morning to help actual people get seen faster. That was the thing she had wanted to tell someone and hadn't been able to, because the someone she had was not the kind of person who could hear it without immediately calculating what it meant for him. Dorothea, she said, when this is over, however it ends, I want to set up a bursary for women in health informatics. Specifically women coming out of community college programs, not universities. That's where I started. Dorothea glanced at her. We can do that. Good, Cecile said. Let's make sure it's funded before the press gets hold of any of it. I don't want it to look like a PR move. It won't, Dorothea said, because it isn't. Right, Cecile said. And she looked back out the window at the river and the slowly breaking ice. 3 weeks later, Bryce's lawyer filed for settlement. The number Harold Finch offered was not $15,000. The forensic accountant had completed her review. The matrimonial home in Westboro, the home Bryce had purchased in his name alone, in a move he had presented as financial efficiency, and which was, as any lawyer would confirm, a deliberate structuring decision, had appreciated significantly. More to the point, the court-ordered review had uncovered that Bryce had, during the marriage, opened 2 lines of business credit using their shared address and, in one case, Cecile's proof of income from her freelance consulting work, without her knowledge or consent. He had not hidden this as skillfully as he believed. The settlement Finch offered included the full assessed value of the matrimonial home, a spousal support arrangement of 4 years at a monthly amount that made Cecile's original ask look modest, and a formal acknowledgement, at Cecile's insistence, and over Finch's strenuous objection, that Bryce had used her financial information without authorization. Cecile accepted the settlement on a Tuesday morning, sitting at the refinished kitchen table, the one she was taking with her when she moved into the house in Sandy Hill that she had already put an offer on. She signed the documents with a pen she had bought at a pharmacy for $1.79. Bryce did not attend the signing. He sent Finch. Finch, to his credit, looked like a man who had revised several of his professional assumptions in the past 3 weeks, which Cecile thought was probably healthy for him. She did not celebrate. She made tea. She called her mother in Scarborough, who had known something was wrong for 3 years and had never said "I told you so," which was one of her mother's finest qualities. She called her closest friend Wren, who had also known and who did say "I told you so," but in the specific way that meant "I was worried about you and I love you and I'm relieved." Both conversations were 15 minutes long. Both ended with "talk soon." Then Cecile put on her coat and went for a walk along the Rideau River, where the ice had broken up entirely and the water was moving cleanly in the morning light. The press, as Dorothea had predicted, found the story. The headline that ran in the Globe and Mail read, "Ottawa health tech founder wins landmark settlement after building 4M software empire during divorce proceedings." The Ottawa Citizen ran a longer feature that focused on ClearPath's use in hospital systems. A technology newsletter ran a piece on the business model. None of the coverage focused particularly on Bryce, which was either journalistic restraint or a considered acknowledgement that the story was not about him. Cecile did one interview. A podcast, not a television segment. She chose this deliberately, because she was more comfortable with words than with cameras, and because the audience for the podcast, Working Women in Healthcare and Technology, was exactly the audience she wanted to talk to. She sat in the podcast host's studio in Canada on a gray March morning with a cup of bad coffee and talked, for 45 minutes, about what it had cost her and what it had built her and the relationship between those two things, which was not as straightforward as people wanted it to be. "Did you know while you were building Birchline," the host asked, "that things with your marriage were ending?" Cecil thought about this for a moment. "I knew that I had stopped being seen," she said finally. "I didn't know yet that being seen wasn't something that was going to start again. I was still hoping it might. And then I stopped hoping and I started working instead, and the working it was mine, in a way that very little had been for a while. I needed something that was mine, and now?" Cecil smiled. "Now I have rather a lot of things that are mine." The bursary launched in April. Cecile named it quietly, without fanfare, after her grandmother, Abina, who had come to Canada from Kumasi with a teaching certificate and $40 and had spent 40 years, making sure the people around her had what they needed to grow. The bursary offered $8,000 annually to 2 women per year in health informatics programs at Ontario community colleges, with a mentorship component that Cecile ran herself, 2 calls a month. No agenda, just questions answered and connections made. The first 2 recipients were announced in May. One was a 23-year-old single mother from Brampton. The other was a 44-year-old woman retraining after a layoff. Both had applied with essays that Cecile read 3 times each. She framed neither the settlement documents nor the Globe headline. Those were records. They lived in a filing cabinet in her home office, because they were facts and facts needed to be kept, but they weren't what she was building toward. What she kept on her desk was a printout of the first hospital report from ClearPath's deployment at the Ottawa General. Wait times in the emergency department had dropped by 22% in the first quarter. Average assessment time was down by 31 minutes. A note at the bottom of the report, handwritten by the triage nursing manager, a woman named Constance who had been working emergency nights for 20 years, read, "This actually works. First software I've used in 20 years that actually works." Cecile had read that note on the morning of the court session, on her phone, in the courthouse parking lot, before she walked in wearing the $14 blazer. She had read it because she needed to remember what was real. Bryce, she learned through mutual contacts, had moved to Toronto with Tara, who had since launched a new product line that incorporated wellness language that Cecile found, when she encountered it online, bracingly hollow. This was not a generous thought, and she allowed herself to have it once and then let it go, the way you let go of things that do not improve withholding. He had not said a word to her since the settlement. Not an acknowledgement, not an apology, not even a logistics email. His silence was absolute, and she found to her moderate surprise that this was perfectly fine. She did not need his words. She had built a vocabulary of her own. 6 months after the settlement, on a Thursday afternoon in early October, with the maple trees on her street doing the extraordinary thing they do every autumn in Ottawa, burning gold and red and orange in a way that never becomes ordinary, no matter how many years you live there. Cecile sat at the refinished kitchen table in her house in Sandy Hill with a cup of good coffee this time, from the cafe on Daly Avenue, and opened her laptop. She had a meeting in 20 minutes with the Health Ministry of Quebec. She had a call at 3 with the 2 bursary recipients. She had a design review at 5 for the next version of ClearPath, which was already in development, because she had been learning this her whole life, that the thing you've made is never finished, it only becomes more itself. She opened the email from the Quebec ministry team. She read the opening paragraph. She allowed herself privately a moment of something that was not quite triumph, because triumph was too loud a word for what she felt. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a person who has been working in a cold room for a very long time and has finally carefully got the heat on. She closed the email. She picked up her coffee. She had work to do.